after we've seen some evidence for the idea that mood affects us because we often try to stay congruent with the mood that we're in, now let's talk about how mood can influence our cognitive processing resources. So this idea is based on the premise that mood affects how we process information. So by that I mean how and how much we process information. And this general perspective on why mood influences behavior um, is thought that positive mood gives rise to a mode of thinking that is more heuristic, shallow, effortless, careless, intuitive. You remember from our dual process theory of cognition that this would be system one thinking, right? So positive mood would give rise to more system one type of thinking, while negative mood would put us in a mental place where we are engaging in more systematic, deep, effortful, careful, deliberate thinking. So, and again, you remember correctly, system two. This is the idea that mood influences how we process information and how much information we process. So if we are in a positive mood, that would bring us into the headspace of system one. And if we're in a negative mood, that would put us in the headspace of system two. Let's take a look if we can find some anecdotal evidence for this. So in a positive mood, people might stop working sooner to go do something else. They might be less accurate in how they work. They apply simpler heuristics or like these rules of thumb that we talked about before in another session. They might use categories that come to mind quickly and are therefore sort of more accessible, stereotype more, and they might be equally persuaded by weak and strong arguments, so that basically you could say people elaborate less on what they find convincing and rather yeah, they don't emphasize so much the quality of a message. They just pick up the sort of the overall idea. Now, if we wanted to find some evidence for this idea that mood influences how we process information, we could consult a study by Bodenhausen et al. From 1994. In this piece of research, there was mood induction, and in this case, participants were told that they were in a piece of research in a study on the psychological structure of happy memories. And they were asked to recall and re-experience and write about an event that had made them very happy, or they were in a control treatment where that wasn't the case, so that they were just asked to write about something neutral. And then in the next task, participants were asked to rate how guilty a specific target person was of some alleged misbehavior. And the identity of this target person who allegedly had done something wrong was manipulated. Either the person was shown as a Hispanic person or as a Caucasian person, and the cue for this was a name. So either a name that was more typical for Hispanic people or a name that was more typical for Caucasian people. And the hypothesis here was that Hispanic people would seem more guilty if our participants were in the positive mood. Why would that be the case? Well, I encourage you to take a quick pause here. Think about why positive mood, if we follow the idea of mood influencing cognitive processing that we've just introduced, why positive mood would lead to a Hispanic person here seemingly being more guilty. All right, now that you've thought about this a little bit, let me go ahead and try to explain. So the idea would be that people in a positive mood are more likely to engage in system one thinking, and thinking that's not very elaborated and that rather relies on intuitions and heuristics and also on stereotypes, compared to people who are in our control condition where there's no specific mood going on. So there's no reason to think that they would only engage or more engage in the system one type thinking. So if participants who are happy given that our mood induction was successful, if participants who are happy engage in more stereotype thinking, that would mean we have to ask ourselves, okay, so what are stereotypes out there about Hispanic versus Caucasian people in terms of um, committing crimes or doing some kind of misbehavior? And the stereotypical content would be that Hispanics are more likely to do things that are illegal than white people. And so if our participants indeed were in a happy mood and therefore in a frame of mind where they're more likely to stereotype, they would be more likely to say that the Hispanic person would be guilty. That is the reasoning. Now, let's take a look at what the results of the study were. What we can see here is, first of all, on the x-axis, we have the affect condition. So we have on the left the happy condition and on the right the neutral condition. And then participants gave a guiltiness rating. This is on the y-axis. So we can see how guilty participants thought the person presented was in the happy versus the neutral condition. And we have information about whether the person who was judged was the person about whom the stereotype fit the guilty question. So that would have been, in this case, the Hispanic person. Those are the black bars. And then we have the light gray bars. This would be the white person where the stereotype didn't fit the idea that they would have a high guiltiness rating. So in other words, this is the mean perceived guilt as a function of the activated stereotype and the emotional state. So first, let's start with the neutral condition. So those are the two bars on the right. And what you can see is that the mean guilt rating is almost the same between the stereotype fitting the guilty story person and the person where the stereotype didn't fit the story. So the Hispanic person and the white person in this case were rated, there was no evidence that there was a difference in how they were rated in terms of guilt. But if we look on the left at the condition where participants were induced to feel happy, here we can see a big difference in the ratings of guilt between, or actually it looks like a big difference, but it's not really that big. If you look at the scale, you can see that this is zoomed in a little bit, right? So we have the scale points, the lowest is 5 and it goes up to 8. So there could have been even more movement on that scale. It looks like there's a big difference, but this is zoomed in. Anyway, so we see that there's a difference between the guilt rating of the Hispanic person compared to the white person by participants who were in a happy mood. And in particular, you can see that the Hispanic person, the stereotype congruent person, was rated to be more guilty than the white person where there was no specific stereotype about doing things, misbehaving and doing illegal things. So this would be evidence for our hypothesis that mood can put people in a specific processing mode and therefore affect how they see the world. So we have our evidence. That's all we need, right? Well, not quite, because this study so far might actually lead us into a problem. It might be the case that thinking happy thoughts in our manipulation, you remember that participants were asked either about happy thoughts or not. That was a control condition then. Thinking about happy thoughts might just take up more working memory capacity because we have to ruminate about this and it's more difficult to think about it. And therefore, because the capacity is limited, this might be the reason why we choose shortcuts and heuristics and stereotypes, right? So it might not even be the case that in the study, mood actually influenced the processing mode. It might have been that mood influenced the kind of the load, the cognitive capacity that was already invested in the task. And the effect that we saw is the case only because of that and not because processing mode was changed. So Bodenhausen et al. Thought this could be an alternative explanation basically of their result, and therefore tried in a follow-up study to induce happiness without a procedure demanding cognitive capacity. So without trying to exclude this alternative explanation that thinking happy thoughts in itself takes up more working memory than not thinking happy thoughts. Yeah? So we want to find some more evidence that indeed the mode that we choose to think in, how we process information has changed. And that is not only the case because our brain is already busy with something else. So how would you do that? How would you induce happiness with a procedure that does not demand cognitive capacities? You can take a second to pause this video here and think about what they might have done. While I will go ahead and tell you what indeed was done in this study. So the mood induction here was done via a motor task. And actually, this was a facial feedback procedure. So participants were either asked to contract the muscle that produces a smile or to loosely contract their hand into a fist. So there was muscle activation involved in both cases, so in both conditions, but one of them was thought to be specific to happiness, so the smile muscles, and the other was supposed to be unrelated, control condition, loosely contracting your hand into a fist. And then participants were told to maintain this pose while reading a scenario and then rating the target person on their guilt as before. So let's take a look at the results and if they look the same as we saw before. So this is a very similar plot to what we saw before. Again, we have the guilt rating on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have the happy conditions where participants were asked to smile, or the neutral condition on the right where participants were asked to clench their hand. And again, we have in black the stereotype consistent target person that would be the Hispanic person, where the stereotype is that they would be more likely to do a illegal deed, and the no stereotype person would be the Caucasian person, where there's no stereotype about them being likely to do any criminal behavior. So what we see is again very similar. So to the previous study, in the condition where participants were asked to clench their hands, so this is neutral and we wouldn't think that it induces any specific information, there was no evidence for a difference between the guilt ratings for the Hispanic and the Caucasian target person. And on the other hand, if participants were asked to smile, we can see here that the guilt rating of the stereotype congruent person, so the Hispanic person, was higher than the guilt rating of the Caucasian person, where there was no stereotype. So this study goes to show us that even when we can rule out the alternative explanation that somehow cognitive capacity was already limited by thinking happy thoughts versus not thinking happy thoughts, by taking out any cognitive processing constraints and only having a procedure that involved motor activation, this would also suggest that mood changes the processing style.
Okay, so now that we've ruled out the alternative explanation that the cognitive processing capacity was limited and therefore we find this effect, there's still an alternative explanation left, which is that maybe participants had just different levels of arousal, and that was the reason why this effect is produced. So maybe people who just clenched their hand, they weren't very aroused, they didn't experience arousal, and therefore there was no difference in stereotyping. But maybe people who were smiling, they experience a different type of arousal. And that is the reason why we have this stereotype effect in this case. But we want to rule out this alternative explanation, right? Because we think it's not only about arousal, we think this effect should be about cognitive processing. It should be about being put in a different processing mode and not just about feeling differently aroused. Okay, so how can we do that? What kind of a manipulation could we have to check or to rule out the alternative explanation of different types of arousal? Bodenhausen et al. Went for this one. They went for a study on music perception, where participants were exposed with arousing happy music and non-arousing, so calming happy music. So instead of controlling for arousal or taking it out of the equation, they systematically manipulated arousal and went to see if that would produce a similar effect to the happy inductions we had before. So in this case, participants were told for 10 minutes to close their eyes and listen, and then they had to make some bogus ratings about the music perception. And then again, they did the same task where they read a story about a target person who was either Hispanic, so stereotype congruent, or Caucasian, so stereotype incongruent, for having done misbehavior, and were again asked to rate their guiltiness. So here we have the happy energetic and the happy calm conditions. And you can see in both cases, we have this effect that we saw before only in the happy condition, but not in the control conditions, right? So in both cases, the stereotype consistent target person was rated higher on guilt than the stereotype inconsistent person. That would mean here that arousal indeed is not the reason why we see no effect in, or no evidence of an effect in the control conditions before. So here, for instance, no evidence for an effect in the control condition, but the effect of different guilt ratings in the happy condition. And we see this happy condition effect here, both in the energetic and the calm case, meaning that arousal is not the reason why this effect was produced. So we've seen, therefore, that it seems like mood can indeed influence the mode of cognitive processing that we're in, whether we are in the system 1 or system 2 thinking mode. Last, we can ask ourselves whether the effect that we've just seen could be because participants want to protect their good mood and therefore are not motivated to engage in effortful processing. So the idea here is that if you are in a good mood, this is a way that you would like to stay. I don't know about you, but I like being in a good mood. So I would like to stay like this. And if many people think like that, then they would be motivated to just stay like that, and staying like that might mean less effortful processing. So we can take a look at whether motivation to process actually plays a role in and intervenes in the connection between mood and cognitive processing that we've seen established before. So here is another follow-up with the same setup. So again, we have our guilt rating of either a stereotyped target person or a not stereotyped target person. And again, you can see two conditions where either happiness was induced or neutral mood was induced, so control condition. But you can see now also in this plot that either there was a motivation induction task or there was no such task. So the, no such instruction. So the motivation induction instruction here on the right would have been, bear in mind, that's what the participants read, bear in mind that you will be held accountable for your judgment of guilt as if you were a judge on a real peer discipline panel. So participants were induced to be very motivated to make a good judgment, to really think it through and make a good judgment. And on the other hand, we have the control condition for that, basically, where there is no motivation induced to do well on this task. Instead, participants were told that judgments would be anonymous. So if we look at the data in the left two panels, where there is no motivation induction, you can see that we see again our big effect of higher guilt ratings in the happiness condition for the stereotyped Hispanic person than for the not stereotyped Caucasian person. And in the neutral condition, actually in this case, it was actually even flipped around. So the not stereotyped Caucasian person got the higher guilt rating in this case than the stereotyped Hispanic person. So this is the effect, sort of similar. This is the effect that we'd seen before. In happiness, we have more reliance on stereotypes. But if we look at the case where there was motivation induction because people were told they would be held accountable for their judgments, what do we see now? These would be the two panels on the right. We see now that for people who were induced to feel happy, the guilt rating of the stereotyped person was actually lower, so not higher, but lower than for the non-stereotyped Caucasian person. And in the neutral condition, both guilt ratings were relatively high, but with a small difference only. Perhaps this is not even a significant difference. Hard to tell without Erebos, and I'm sorry that they are not in this lecture series. But what does this mean? Well, it means that motivation is the key. So normally, people try to correct for stereotypical judgments, but perhaps when we are in a happy mood and we don't really have a motivation to think very critically and very effortfully about what we're doing, this might be the reason for why we process information differently. Potentially, this is because we feel overly confident when we're in a happy mood. For instance, because being in a good mood might make us selectively remember things that are positive about ourselves, right? It makes us feel good about ourselves and therefore perhaps more confident, and perhaps therefore we don't think we have to think stuff through quite to so much detail as when we're not in a happy mood. Okay, so the takeaway from this is, well, indeed, we find some evidence that happiness or mood generally affects how we process information. The key to this is motivation. So being motivated to think stuff through will override this effect if there is such an induction of motivation.